Good. Hello, everybody. Very nice to see some friends that I haven't seen for a long time. And I hope, just to start, I didn't actually realize how long the title that I had made was until I put it onto the slide. But this is, in a sense, I started working in Iran almost 20 years ago, and then continued working there for around 10 years, and then started to work in India. So this is an attempt for me to combine the work that I've done in Iran with some of the new things that we've done in India, in a sense that it creates opportunities to think a little bit about urbanism and urban processes, but not by looking at urban centers themselves, but by looking at the types of places in between, the types of things that link urban centers together. And there are two main components of what I'm going to talk about. One of them is thinking about roots and the way that populations move in the past, moved, and also thinking about settlement landscapes and hinterlands. So the types of sites that exist that support an urban center and make it possible for people to live in an urban center, and how we get understanding and insight about those sorts of sites. So the specific work that I'm going to present is sort of building on my own previous research, but is also work that came out of this TwoRains project, which was a project funded by the European Research Council. And I work with a number of people on that. Hector Arengo, Toby Wilkinson, Friederike Jöcke, Helen Taylor, and Lloyd Weeks, who are collaborators who I've worked with either in Cambridge or in the UK. Very much the work and my interest in roots and also landscapes goes all the way back to when I was a student. And also the very first time I went to Iran in 2002, and I did a survey with Kourosh Rustai and Professor Dan Potts and Lloyd Weeks and we spent several weeks driving around Iran in a vehicle, following routes and understanding landscapes. And what was clear to me at that time, and what became ever clearer as I worked through my research itself, was how complex the landscape of Iran was and how diverse the environments and landscapes of the Iranian Plateau were, and how variable they were. So especially things, this map shows you the locations of a number of most important archaeological sites from the Bronze Age in Iran that are shown in triangles. They're not identified, but it also shows you the distribution of rainfall on the Iranian Plateau and the location in white circles of some of the paleoclimate records that we know about. So in actual fact, we know that the modern climate and rainfall in Iran is very, very complex. We know that large areas of the central plateau are dominated by deserts and very arid environments, but some parts of the Iranian plateau get an abundance of water and they have snowfall and other sorts of things. So this is a landscape that's very, very complicated and challenging to live in and also to traverse. Now, I became fascinated by the possibilities of doing archaeological research, but also understanding roots and movement when I first went there. But it's very clear that for a very long time, archaeologists have been interested in roots and movement across Iran and across the Iranian Plateau, particularly the great Sir Aurel Stein, who conducted numerous surveys in the early part of the 20th century, where he was mapping routes of movement across and around the Iranian Plateau at various points in time, and publishing these quite spectacular and striking maps. And if you combine all of the maps of Aurel Stein, you can actually see he was quite systematic in exploring various areas, discovering some of the most important archaeological sites or rediscovering some of the most important archaeological sites that we know of. And Stein was at that point putting together pieces of historical evidence and landscape understandings to get some keen insights into the way that people moved across the landscape. The importance of the Iranian Plateau is sort of increased over time in terms of people's understanding of a range of different types of archaeological issues. So, for example, in the 1990s, Colin Renfrew published a very short paper in a book about the early domestication of plants and animals. And he highlighted the fact that the Iranian Plateau was a very, very important zone across which early domestication processes took place. And there was a dispersal of plant and animal species and also human populations as well. And at that point, he highlighted the importance of different routes across the Iranian Plateau, either a northerly route and or a southerly route. and to move beyond the Fertile Crescent. So moving out of parts of Western Asia, whether they be in the central Western Zagros or the northern parts of the Iranian Plateau, and across towards the East and Central Asia. Now, importantly, to traverse the Zagros Mountains and to cross the Iranian Plateau requires quite specific types of adaptations. We know some of the earliest Neolithic sites in Iran exist on the Piedmont zones at the bottom of the Zagros Mountains or in the intermontane valleys. But to actually get up higher into the mountains and to cross the Iranian Plateau requires a specific set of adaptations. And I think it's very important to sort of think in terms of the big picture, in terms of how people move and the types of dynamics and the way that they interact with their landscape. Now, there's been a range of research that's been carried out relatively recently that opens up new ways of thinking about the way that humans and also plants and animals interact with the landscape and maybe were dispersed over time. Now, I could have shown you an example of the human genetic research, which was conducted and published quite recently. But what I'm just showing you here is probably a paper that was less well known, is a publication of the genetics of barley across Southern Asia. And it highlights basically the colors represent different barley land races. And what we have in actual fact is clear evidence for different land races in different parts of Southern and East Asia. And it's likely that these land races, different land races that are clearly in evidence. And what's interestingly enough is that there does seem to be a spatial separation between the barley land races that exist on the southern side of the Iranian Plateau and that are seen to be quite commonly distributed into the main part of South Asia, India. And then there are different barley land races in the northern side of the Iranian Plateau. So there's a dark blue set of barley land races that seem to be moving across the southern side and into South Asia. And across the north, we have the ones that are marked by the pink and yellow and different land races, which seem to be much more oriented towards Central Asia. And it is interesting that the yellow land races going up towards Central Asia are the ones that seem to match genetically with the land races being found in China. So we seem to have different trajectories, possibly different dispersals of crops, for example, in the past that reflect probably different dynamics of domestication and different movements. Now, it's interesting to think at a big picture. You can think that we can understand something like the dispersal of a crop species and presumably the humans that were related to that by looking at a map like this. But in actual fact, the important thing is to understand what was the sort of on the ground reality and what's the on the ground process. And going back to very early phases of when I started to work in Iran, I started to do things like drawing blobs on maps to try and understand exactly where on the Iranian Plateau, for example, human populations were concentrated. And this sort of idea of drawing shapes on a map was highlighted by the fact that people do surveys in specific areas and they find archaeological sites in specific locations. But the Iranian Plateau is characterized by the fact that there's only limited range of locations that populations can move due to the nature of the topography. It was possible to sort of speculate and to draw routes across the landscape and that sort of make sense as ways of linking up individual locations. And it's highly likely that ancient populations were focusing on specific environments in which to live. For example, what you can see on the top right-hand side is an image of an alluvial fan, a very nice alluvial fan system in Fars. But we know that the Iranian Plateau has an abundance of these sorts of fan locations, which are actually very, very suitable for early agriculture. Martha Prickett identified several of these close to Tepe Yahya in southeastern Iran. So we know that there are specific locations where ancient settlements were located. What we don't necessarily know is how people move between those settlements. So what my colleagues and I here started to do was to try and work out methods that we could use to use the power of remote sensing and supercomputer availability to try and combine different types of data that would not normally be used by archaeologists to really try and understand movement across the landscape. So one of the initial things we did was to try methods that are like least cost paths. So you draw two dots on a map and you combine that with a topographic analysis to try and understand the routes of movement between individual paths. But Hector Arengo recognized that it would be possible to use some new tools that are actually readily available via the internet, including the thing that's used popularly by many of us, Google Maps, is also combined into another system called Google Earth Engine, which is a publicly accessible data toolkit that allows you to make use of a wide range of remote sensing map imagery and other types of images that are all available via the Google Earth platform. And it's data of up to 40 years in duration, to over 25,000 different images that could be combined to create different types of multispectral resolution images of the landscape of a particular part of the world that one might be interested in. So what you can see on this image is a workflow which was constructed as a way of using Google Earth Engine and combining that with the locations of archaeological sites to develop cost surfaces, the cost in energy to move between individual points on a map. We were particularly interested in the ability or the potential for movement over very long distances. It is possible to choose any points on a map and to calculate the costs of moving between those locations. But we combine Google Earth Engine, which is a cloud-based platform. You use Google's supercomputers, you don't need your own. We combine that with things like radar, topography imagery, and topographic information about ground variability, and then combined it using GIS software to try and create corridors of movement that would allow us to test different hypotheses about what it was like to move between individual locations. So what we did, I'm going to show you some examples of the test drive that we attempted on this front. But the main argument or the main point to make is that we really, in the first instance, we were trying to understand how difficult it was to move across the Iranian Plateau from one side to the other. So we chose, on the left-hand side, you can see a red dot, which is actually the original design was to choose the site of Chogabonut, which is in Khuzestan. It's actually located quite close to Chogamish and also the site of Susa. So in actual fact, probably you could use the argument that the location on the left-hand side of the image is a lowland Khuzestan settlement, for example. The red dot on the right-hand side is the archaeological site of Mehrgarh, which is in Pakistan. We know that aceramic Neolithic sites exist in both ends of the Iranian Plateau. So the suggestion was perhaps, well, how were populations moving? How did the aceramic Neolithic technologies and concepts move? We don't necessarily think that one person moved from one location to the other, but what are the routes of movement that one group may have been able to move? So if you just purely choose these two locations, it was clear that if you just consider something like a cost path, which is based on the availability of desert, the presence of desert, for example, if desert is a high cost factor, and we ran an algorithm using 30-meter cells, it was actually evident that it was preferable, a lower cost, to move around the northern side of the Iranian Plateau if desert was the major factor. This is interesting because it doesn't match the archaeological evidence. So it also made it clear that the presence of desert was not the only reason that dictated why people may have moved in certain directions. If we added a factor for the presence of water and desert as different sorts of factors that dictate why and how people move through the landscape, we get different sorts of patterns, and we see the dominance of movement across the northern part of the plateau, and also indications that maybe there are potential routes across the southern side of the plateau. Where the real clever part of the analysis comes was where Hector Arengo realized that if we combined multiple factors, so going beyond what you would normally do as a least cost path, but combining factors like slope, the presence of water, desert, temperature, shadow, and also the seasonal presence of snow and snowmelt, if all of these factors are combined into an analytical algorithm, it was possible to actually create quite sophisticated cost corridors between different locations. Now, interestingly enough, if those of you who know the landscape of southern Iran will see that this map actually maps and highlights a number of different routes which we know exist between the lowlands of Khuzestan, the highlands of Fars, the eastern part of Fars, areas in Kerman, areas in Makran in Pakistan and across southern Baluchistan and all the way up to Merga. So all of a sudden we realize when it's possible to consider all of these factors, we may be getting closer to ways of understanding routes across the landscape. And what's really important is actually we're not identifying one individual path, but we're identifying a range of possibilities. And so the colors in these maps highlight that in these particular maps, the more blue, the more likelihood that these routes were being used. This sort of opened my mind in many ways. If we add a different point, so one example, we chose another location at a different part of the of the greater Iranian Plateau. We chose the location of Sarisang in northern Afghanistan, which we know is the location of the source of lapis lazuli, which is being used from the very, millennia earlier than the Bronze Age, for example. Interestingly enough, if you try and make a link between the northern part of Afghanistan and, say, Chogabonut, you see routes of movement which go via Bactria and Margiana across parts of Khorasan. And interestingly enough, the least cost corridor takes you around the coast of the Caspian rather than across the central plateau, which is not necessarily what you would expect. But then there is a very clear set of paths and routes through the central western Zagreb. To make it even more complicated in some respects, we also added the important site of Shahisokta in the central part of Sistan to see what the corridors of movement might be that link up people moving between Sarisang, Shahisokta, Merga, and Chogabonut, just as examples. So you can see that there's a range of other sorts of routes and corridors of movement, but in a very interesting way, you can see a very coherent set of possibilities moving across the central part of the Iranian Plateau. So we combined all of these things, all of these three different routes together to produce a map that, in a sense, highlights a vast range of possibilities of possible routes of movement across from different sides of the Iranian Plateau. Now, I know that some of you are saying, well, what about a different route down towards the coastline of the Arabian Sea or the Persian Gulf, for example? All of those things are possible and they can be investigated by using different start and end points. But this was deliberately chosen as a very sort of broad measure to try and understand routes of movement across the Iranian Plateau. Now, what really becomes interesting is when we start to consider specific archaeological questions. Now, for me, I've long had an interest in the Proto-Elamite period and things like the spread and dispersal of writing. Now, this is a version of a map which was published in a paper that was written by Jakob Dahl and Dan Potts and myself, where we were trying to understand the spatial distribution of the movement of early writing technologies. The spread of proto-writing has suggested these are stamped bullae and other things, numerical tablets, and the suggestion perhaps there's connectivity between Uruk and Susa, and then connectivity between Susa and the highland parts of Iran. And also thinking about the Proto-Elamite writing system, which François Dessay spoke about several weeks ago, and the likelihood that there was connectivity between Susa and all the way across the southern side of the Iranian Plateau to Tali Malyan, Tepe Yahya, and up across the northern part of the plateau as well. Now, these maps are useful because they provide the possibility of links, but they don't tell us how people may have moved across the landscape. Now, what's particularly interesting if we then start to show these site locations on our map that's showing the routes, it's particularly interesting. You can see particular patterns in ways of movement across the landscape. And it definitely highlights, for example, the likelihood that the evidence for proto-writing within Iran seems to be quite specifically restricted to these northerly routes, at least the ones that I've identified here. Whereas the Proto-Elamite writing system seems to be moving in at least two different directions. Many of the red circles on this map are oriented towards what's shown in this image is a combination of routes that are highlighted by different colors. So the routes probably moving along the northern side of the plateau are the ones in green. The ones moving across the southern side of the plateau are the ones in blue. And the ones moving across the central part are the ones in red. And you can see that the Proto-Elamite settlements, the settlements where Proto-Elamite writing has been attested, either seem to be clustered on the northerly route or largely on the southerly trajectory, with the exception of Shari Sokta, where we know that there's one Proto-Elamite tablet that's been detected. But so you can see that there are routes of connectivity that make sense of the distribution of the material culture. And perhaps we can use this method, this approach, to actually speculate about the ways in which the technology moved, but also the way perhaps where we may be able to conduct future archaeological exploration to try and identify new categories of material that relate to these routes of movement. Now, that's just a brief example of a case study from the Chalcolithic period. If we move forward into the 3rd millennium BC, we know that the Iranian Plateau was characterized by a number of different political entities that have names. The names are documented in Mesopotamian texts. We know of places like Elam and Anshan. We know the place of Marhashi. We have records of places like Dilmun and Magan and Meluha, which exist in different parts of the Persian Gulf and further to the east. And we know that the populations living in these areas were interacting with each other over very long periods of time. So Toby Wilkinson, one of the people that contributed to the original part of this research, developed a sort of a way of a map which shows the way that material was moving around in the 3rd millennium BC. And he highlights on this map some examples of the way that archaeologists traditionally think about movement and routes. Now, what's interesting, if we adjust the thinking to plot the locations of archaeological sites in relationship to these routes of movement that we're hypothesizing, we actually see quite an interesting pattern. So this shows the locations of some of the most important sites that were occupied in the 3rd millennium BC. And it highlights, for example, where Sarisang is, the location of Susa in Khuzestan, the site of Nausharo, which is in Balochistan in Pakistan, which is very close to Merga, and highlights Shahi Sokta in the middle, in Sistan. Now, if we look at the locations of the archaeological sites and we speculate about various things, we see some patterns that make a lot of sense. There are connections between, there are routes, sorry, not necessarily connections, routes via which people would have been able to move from Sarisang to reach Shari Sokta. And perhaps no surprise, that route goes immediately past Mundigak. The routes are also not very far away to get to Nausharo. But importantly, these are not individual routes, but they are corridors of movement via which people can move. There's a number of interesting patterns that you can see here that link across the southern side of the Iranian Plateau. So it's likely that there was a series of different routes that would enable movement from Susa up into the highlands. Some of those routes go via regions that I've worked in with my Iranian colleagues, like Mamasani. You can see Tali Malyan is located along these routes as well. But then once you go further to the east from Tali Malyan, a range of options open up. There are places to the east of Tali Malyan, like Fasa and Darab, these intermontane plains that exist in eastern Fars. But there is a different set of routes, or a different set of corridors, I should say, that link from Tali Malyan towards places like Tali Iblis and Shahgad, as opposed to places like Tepe Yahya, Kona Sandal, Matutabad, and locations in the Halil Rud, a little bit further to the south. There are also routes that must exist between places like Shahgad, Tepe Yahya, and other areas in eastern Iran. And then there are different ways of moving between places like Shahgad and Shahi Sokta, based on water availability and the ability to move across the landscape. Now, some of this is no doubt not a surprise, but using these methods gives us really exciting opportunities to work out where people may have moved in the past, and potentially where to do things like conduct new archaeological surveys to understand the distribution of sites and the locations of sites. And that, hopefully that point takes me into the second part of the talk, which is really an emphasis on the importance of settlement and landscape archaeology for bigger understanding of processes, especially related to urbanism and the developments of cities. Now, this has been a type of work that's been conducted for decades in different parts of the ancient Near East. There's actually a considerable range of new approaches that are being used in different areas at the moment. This just shows some examples of the work that's been done by people like Jason and Emily Hammer in terms of using corona images or spy images, spy plane images that were taken in the 1950s, which actually record lost landscapes which are now no longer visible. And I think these create really exciting opportunities in many ways, because it highlights the fact that we can use new types of approaches that make use of old information that was not collected for archaeological purposes. And in the end, we can end up with really exciting archaeological information that provides insights into the way that people lived in landscapes and people lived in settled areas. Now, I know that there is actually an extremely long tradition of archaeological survey work that's been carried out in Iran, going throughout the last 20 years especially, but also going all the way back to the 1930s, where people have been using innovations like aeroplanes and other sorts of things to identify archaeological sites. So I'm not going to show you an example of landscape survey in Iran, but I will be showing you some examples of what the type of work that I've been doing in India and Pakistan, just to highlight a number of possibilities and potentialities for this sort of research. Now, the work that I've been doing in Pakistan is related to the Indus civilization, which is contemporaneous with a lot of the developments that we know were taking place in Iran. And I know many of the audience don't need an introduction to the Indus civilization, but effectively the important thing to know is that Indus civilization underwent a phase of urbanism in the 3rd millennium BC. So we see the appearance of large urban centers, and then those urban centers declined. And we have a very specific process that we can understand by looking at settlement archaeology data. So there's been a lot of argument and discussion about the importance of cities in the Indus context. We know that there's actually a relatively small number of cities and that there's a very large number of rural settlements. And the Indus civilization populations were making use of some of the traditional plant and animal domesticates that we would know from Western Asia. But they also made use of local domesticates as well, including the zebu, different types of millet and summer crops, including rice and other sorts of aspects. But one of the things that's important in the Indus context is that the rural context we now know is particularly critical in understanding the development of cities, but also Indus lifeways. And while quite a lot of attention is focused on the urban centers, work that's been done actually starting even in the 1970s, but particularly expanding in the last 20 years, including the work by Professor Rita Wright, looking at the Beas survey, very, very close to Harappa, and other work that's been conducted in both Pakistan and India is really highlighting the importance of settlement distribution information. And what's interesting in that respect is that there's a lot of different data that suggests that there's a massive number of archaeological sites that maybe exist in the Indus context. But what's really interesting in many ways is that those sites seem to be concentrated in particular locations. Now, this is a map that's a heat map that emphasizes that there's many archaeological sites known in this area of the central part of Punjab and also large parts of India. Now, these are maps that were produced by one of my colleagues, Adam Green, and it highlights where the majority of these settlements are located. But it's now clear that this information is slightly misleading because it doesn't take account for a lot of the variability in terms of the data that we have. And I think this is a factor that's very important for archaeologists generally when thinking about settlement information, is that we tend to assume that the data that we have is representative of the distribution of information across the landscape. Whereas in actual fact, inevitably what we have is concentrations of information that reflect where we've conducted the work and how we've conducted the work. So as an example of the types of problems that we have in the Indus context, we've done things like conducting surveys. In 2008, we looked at an existing site location, which you can see on the left-hand side, as recorded in a site location database. And we tried to find the site, and we realized that it was actually 11 kilometers away from the database location. So there was actually significant errors in the published database and the published locations of many of the sites. We also realized that it's often pointed out that settlements are located very, very close to rivers or ancient rivers, paleo rivers. But in many cases, the landscape has changed quite significantly and substantially. So what you can see on this map is the location of an ancient site called Banavali, which is often mentioned as being on the banks of the Gaga River. But it's very easy to get confused because the modern course of the Gaga River is very different to the ancient course of the river. And it's clear that there were channels and paleo channels across the landscape, for example, but the sites don't necessarily match neatly to what we would expect. We also realized that what we know about the distribution of settlement is actually very specifically influenced by where people have done surveys. So if you look on this map, it looks like we have nice concentrations of settlements in specific locations. If we highlight where the limits of the survey were, you can see that we find lots more settlements when we conduct surveys in specific locations. So what we have as a published data set doesn't necessarily match what might be there on the ground. And what's very clear is that there's almost always more archaeological sites than have actually been recorded. So we set out to try and resolve some of these issues by a long-term series of surveys to really try and understand landscape change. And we wanted to combine archaeological surveys with work on the ground to understand hydrology and landscapes and evolution and development of all of these different interrelated components. So I'm just going to briefly highlight some trajectories that we've been able to reconstruct, making use of the types of technology and the types of techniques that I mentioned to move across the Iranian Plateau. So although the landscape's different, the same methods can be sort of applied, or at least similar ones. And this comes back around to this idea of using a big data approach. So using a tool like Google Earth Engine and having an extremely clever person like Hector Arango writing some digital code, it has been possible to run analyses using thousands of different satellite images to assess landscapes that show variation by season and variation over time in terms of the availability of water. And we can also use similar techniques to combine different types of topographic information to generate micro-topographic relief models that enable us to really see small levels of variation and change in topography on the surface. Now, the reason that this is important in this particular location is that we know that there is an abundance of channels and paleo channels that have existed over time. We know that these rivers and watercourses move, and we know that they are very difficult to see on the ground today. So we've tried to work out methods using the satellite imagery and also methods using the digital elevation models to try and reconstruct these ancient watercourses across a specific part of northwestern India. Now, what you can see in this particular image highlights different types of information. Now, the image, what is shown in black on this image is the location of modern towns and canals and roads that link those towns together, and little villages and other sorts of things. But if you try to ignore the black and focus on the green and red in the background, I apologize for those who may not be able to see the differences with color blindness. I can't do much about that, I'm afraid. But the green and blue images in the back show shapes that are small, sinuous levees, actually, that are very, very preserved in a very low level on the ground. And you can see that we have clear evidence for the existence of meandering rivers and a complex hydrology that existed in the past. Now, using lots of gradual documentation and by hand measurement, Hector Arengo was actually able to trace thousands and thousands of kilometers of ancient river systems across northwestern India. And so many ways we have, in black, you can see on this map, we see modern river courses. We have a large paleo river shown in gray across the middle that's often been described and identified. And the areas that you can see that are highlighted in the green and the pink, purple lines, please ignore the red ones, highlight the courses of these dozens of different paleo channels that move across this complex landscape. So we see that we have lots of variation in the availability of water, and that has an impact upon where settlements are located. So we have also using the microtopography approach. It's possible also to use digital elevation models to reconstruct river systems and to reconstruct the hydrology of the landscape as well. So again, we've got different ways of reconstructing the landscape and the landscape forms, and then that gives us an opportunity of matching up our archaeological data on the ground. So I'll try and move through this reasonably quickly. I recognize we started a little bit late, but I don't want to keep you all too long. But we conducted archaeological surveys altogether for around 10 years in a number of different locations. I'm not going to talk about them all in detail. I'm just going to mention that we've conducted surveys in many parts of northwestern India. And what we discovered was some specific things, especially when we looked at individual important sites. Now, this is the fabulous ancient site of Rakhigarhi, which is the largest of the Indus civilization settlements in northwestern India. And before we conducted work in this area, we knew that this large center existed, and we knew that there were settlements in the hinterland around Rakhigarhi. What we didn't know is how this site was situated, how this large urban center was supported by settlements in its hinterland, and what was the long-term settlement history of this location. So we conducted a survey within 15 kilometers of the site of Rakhigarhi, and we actually doubled the number of archaeological sites that were known in this region. And importantly, we realized that previous understanding was very limited, but we realized also that there was actually a very important set of data, historical information that had been collected almost 100 years ago that provided a really important source of information about the locations of archaeological sites. So we started to look at historical maps. These were maps that were actually documented as a part of the Survey of India, which was developed under the period of British imperial control in India and Pakistan. And there was a systematic survey of the whole of South Asia that was undertaken. And in the process of recording that survey, which was designed for very imperial requirements, but in the process, the surveyors actually documented thousands and thousands of archaeological sites in their process. So at the top of this image on the right-hand side, you can see the types of symbols that were being used in the surveying maps to demarcate archaeological sites. They're not marked as being archaeological sites, they're just marked as being features on the topography. But if we have a look down here on the bottom, you can see a number of archaeological sites located close to Rakhigarhi, and all of them are identified on these maps. So using something like a tool, which had existed for 100 years and created for a completely different purpose, we combined these historical maps with the remote sensing imagery and the topography, and then started to use methods on the ground, which were developed by my colleague Adam Green, to engage in very, very targeted archaeological survey, where we go to visit locations where we believe that there is an archaeological site in advance. We've already looked at it and identified these locations based on the maps and the topography and the vegetation assessments. Then we can go onto the ground and visit these sites. And we designed a method where we visited specific locations. The landscape was divided up into artificial hexagons so that we could keep a track of progress. And with luck, we would find archaeological sites like this one, where we can see this is a landscape which is intensively cultivated. But thankfully, the modern population have not removed this archaeological site, and it's actually relatively well preserved. And we could conduct archaeological surface collections on sites like these. And we developed a method. Adam has designed this approach where we select specific locations on the mound. We conduct a walking pedestrian survey, and really trying to do very specific things, but very, very straightforward things. Nothing sophisticated, just purely working out the location of the site and the period in which it was occupied, and making an assessment on the level of preservation. And using this approach, we've actually been able to combine a whole set of different surveys together and get a very clear understanding of the distributions of archaeological sites across very large areas. This is an area that's about 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers in size, which is actually quite substantial in terms of land coverage. Importantly, it became clear that when we identified mound features on the ground, when we identified mound features or other types of archaeological signatures on the basis of what we could see on the maps, we then visit them on the ground, and in many instances, there's no site preserved. So this map highlights the white dots are all of the locations that were visited by Adam and his team that he worked with, Aftab Alam and other colleagues from collaborating university in India, Banaras Hindu University. They visited hundreds of sites that were actually no longer sites. Either the sites have been destroyed, or perhaps the surveyors were documenting something that was not an archaeological site. But by using this targeted approach, we're actually able to find hundreds of new archaeological sites. And that then gives us an opportunity to understand changes in the landscape, which were difficult to appreciate before. So the importance of these methods are that it allows us to move quickly and make very rapid assessments. And at least then we can cover the landscape at a very large scale. And it makes it possible to work out where you need to go to visit to do detailed survey work in future. So in that respect, we recognized that there were some interesting patterns in this area of northwestern India that we looked at, especially when it comes to understanding urbanism and the development of different types of settlement patterns, and also the relationship between settlements and rivers. So this basically highlights the importance of a cluster of settlements around the site of Rakhigarhi on the lower side. And you can see a large river in the northern part, which doesn't have very many settlements associated with it. This is the so-called the Gaga Hakra or Sarasvati River in the northern part. This is the period before we have urban settlements. When we have urban settlements appear, we see changes in the distribution of settlements. There's a depopulation in the area to the north in this particular instance, and a concentration of settlements around the urban center of Rakhigarhi. And then this is during the Indus urban period. And then after the urban period declines, we see a redistribution of settlement into the landscape. What's interesting is that several of the settlements, so the large urban settlements disappear, but it seems as though populations were living in clusters of settlements, which is something that I know John Alden has commented on in areas of southwestern Iran as a possible mode of living. And it's something that we perhaps are seeing here. Now, just the last piece of information I'd like to highlight for you is another method that we've started to use. Now, the reason I'm going through all of these methods in a way is because I actually think that they're very broadly usable in different parts of the world, and certainly would be usable, that could be tried by archaeologists working in Iran. Now, one of the areas that has been subjected to intensive survey in recent decades was the area in southern Punjab in Pakistan, which is where archaeological surveys were conducted by Rafiq Mughal, and he identified hundreds of archaeological sites in a region called Cholistan. And this is used to build important hypotheses about the origins of urbanism and the developments of Indus civilization, complexity, and other ideas. Now, Cholistan is very interesting because it sits right on the margins of the desert. Now, what's unusual in this context, in the sense, is that it's often presented, this data set, as though we see an important continuity and rise in population over time. But however, if you look at this data and consider that, you know, the earliest sites are the ones that exist within the pink shapes. The urban period sites are the ones in the zone with orange shapes. And then the post-urban period, we see a contraction and reduction of settlement locations. So what this highlights in many ways is long-term change in where settlements were located. I was particularly interested in trying to then get some understanding of the degree to which this landscape provided us with evidence for clear locations of settlement and change over time. Now, one of the things that I noticed is that there's large numbers of sites seem to be occupied in one period only. And it seems quite likely that although we have substantial concentrations of settlement in different periods in Cholistan, it's very likely that small numbers of these sites were occupied at the same time. And it's interesting, I'm going to move past this because I think it's not particularly helpful to talk about this in detail. But it actually, a paper that was published last year highlighted the fact that it is possible that actually small numbers of these settlements were occupied contemporaneously. And this may be due to the fact that this is the very unstable landscape context. It's right on the margins of the desert, and water supply is actually extremely important. So it seems like the populations living in Cholistan possibly moved a great deal. One of the things that's always been of interest, however, was the fact that it was never clear whether we knew where all of the settlements were in this particular location. So using a combination of the types of methods that we've been applying so far, Hector Arengo and Frances Conesa and Arnau Garcia and some other colleagues based here in Cambridge were able to carry out analyses using different types of satellite imagery as a way of trying to work out the ideal method to use to identify archaeological sites from space effectively. So using sentinel data and using multispectral imagery, radar imagery that's being collected across the entire surface of the planet, it was possible to identify an archaeological site, as you can see here on the top left-hand side, and then to look at the different types of spectral characteristics, how it looks in the red, green, and blue spectrum, how it looks in infrared spectrum, and other types of parts of the visible spectrum, and then use information. So using information from the locations of known sites, and then combining that information and running computer assessment, combining over 1,000 different images from different color band combinations to assess the likelihood of the discovery of archaeological sites. So Hector and Frances and Arnau Garcia managed to combine these thousands of different remote sensing imagery and filter that imagery out and to train a computer to detect an archaeological site and to apply a way of getting the computer to highlight likely locations. And they were actually able to generate images like this, which you can see what the area here in purple is actually desert floor and agricultural land. And the high likelihood of archaeological sites are shown in yellow and white. So they're actually able to use the computer to, again, highlight where archaeological sites may be located. And these same sort of methods can be used in the arid regions of Iran to highlight likely archaeological sites. So this is a paper that was published last year in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And we were able to highlight that they were actually able to discover document over 500 archaeological sites, and only 1/3 of those sites had been observed before. One of the things that they noticed was that there were several very large sites, over 30 hectares in size. And so it does change the way that we think about the nature of urbanism and urban settlements in this location. It was possible to differentiate very clearly between sand dunes and archaeological sites and material that had human signatures on them. What was difficult, we know, is that it's likely that in certain locations that sites were being buried. And it's also clear that unusual sites were not easy to discover within this context. But it gives us an opportunity to identify possible sites using a computer and using machine learning to try and extract information We discovered all sorts of different shapes that were potential archaeological sites, which are shown in this image on the right-hand side. If we were lucky, we found a signature that was very clearly a nice circular archaeological site. Some of the sites, it was clear there was a sand dune sitting directly upon the site, so you couldn't actually see very much of it. And there's all sorts of different types of characteristics. But what's very interesting is that using these methods actually saves a lot of time in terms of archaeological prospection on the ground. And it allows an archaeologist to survey very, very large areas and to understand the nature of distribution of settlement, at least up into the modern period. Now, the very, very last component, I just wanted to highlight a little bit of the work that we've been doing at a very small level to realize that we're not just talking about gigantic landscapes, but if we want to understand a city and its local landscape, we need to understand how a city survives. So combining looking at locations of settlements in the hinterland, we can combine these methods. So look at where a watercourse may exist in a landscape and the way it links together between an urban center, which you can see up here on the right-hand side, and this red-colored tracing of the paleo channel across the landscape, and its relationship to the locations of archaeological sites, which is particularly interesting. Now, using these methods is extremely important in the area of India where we're working, because in actual fact, you can't always see the archaeological sites that you're looking for. And this is largely as a result of the fact that a lot of the land has been modified quite intensively by modern agriculture and alluviation. But what we've done, the last piece, is actually to do work on the ground and to do systematic surveying of an archaeological site, and to do things like coring into the ground around an archaeological site and documenting the geomorphology and the geoarchaeology under the site, and to try and understand the local context at a very, very small scale around these settlements. So it is possible to do very, very focused information and work analysis around an individual archaeological site. And this particular site has shown that even though the modern ground surface shows almost nothing, underneath the surface, there's different sorts of watercourses, ponds, levees, and areas that are almost certainly being used for agricultural fields. Now, I've given you an enormous amount of information, and I hope it's been clear. The project work is, even though it includes areas of Iran, it's largely been done under the banner of two projects that were designed to be doing archaeological work, the Indus civilization in India and Pakistan. We've been very, very lucky having a lot of collaborators and being given a lot funding from a number of different institutions, which I'm very, very grateful for. We've only been able to do this with the authorization of the archaeological authorities in India. I'd like to thank the European Research Council and all these other funding bodies that have made this possible. But most especially, I'd like to thank all of my collaborators who are listed here, and they're actually far too numerous to list by name, but especially for the work in this paper. The team that's the remote sensing team led by Hector Arengo has been invaluable and irreplaceable in many respects. And I'd just like to thank everyone and thank you all for listening.